Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Barnstable Clean Water Coalition for organizing this this series and for this evening and for all the important work that you do. I'm very proud to be a part of the organization and glad to have a number of you with us this evening. So I'm going to be speaking this evening about landscapes. And I have four primary themes here that I'll be addressing through this talk. The premises, if you will. The Cape and Islands are distinctive landscapes, but they're under multiple stresses. And conventional landscape practices can be criticized, but they can also be a part of an environmental solution. I believe, and I advocate, that ecological design presents an alternative that can be beautiful throughout the seasons. And by doing this, we can keep the Cape and the islands beautiful and healthy. We need to be both of those. So the first point about this being a fragile landscape, many of you know that the Cape has a pretty unique glacial history, which has resulted in very sandy soils that are drought prone and low nutrient because the sand doesn't retain a lot of nutrients. Underneath the Cape, we have a gigantic sole source aquifer that is a beautiful source of fresh water, but it's also vulnerable to contamination. And also, and increasingly so, the coastal geography of the Cape and Islands exposes it severely to the effects of climate and climate change. So these stresses are going to only be getting more severe, but these stresses also give the region its distinct and memorable character. It's what actually makes the Cape look like the Cape, the plants and the biota that have adapted to these conditions over time. So what's wrong with conventional landscape design? As he said, you know, it looks a little bit like it could be New Jersey or anywhere. Generic plants, I call them. You know, these are plants that come from the nursery industry that they're not really adapted to the conditions on the Cape. And they're definitely not adapted to the stressful conditions on the Cape. And therefore they rely on what I call unsustainable horticultural props, irrigation systems, fertilizers, pesticides. These are the materials and practices that a lot of these landscapes depend on to survive. And that is a problem, especially in the context of the water quality crisis. And I don't use that word lightly. I believe that we are in the beginning of a crisis in water quality on the Cape, and I will discuss that in a moment. Okay, so these are the issues with conventional landscape design. So a little bit more about what this water quality crisis, as I have claimed. In 2015, the Massachusetts Estuaries program assessed all of the estuaries on the Cape and found that 80% of the estuaries are impaired. And those of you who live here know that we've seen evidence of this, unfortunately, in the form of algae blooms and fish kills in recent years. So this is 5 years old now, and it seems to be getting worse. A more recent study by the Association for the Protection of Cape Cod last fall found that 39% of lakes and ponds that they sampled had unacceptable water quality. So there's trouble here, and it's visible in the surface waters of the Cape. 80% of the nitrate pollution comes from septic systems, and that's not the subject of my talk this evening. It is a subject that the coalition is very much involved with in exploring innovative alternatives to solve. Another solution to this problem is to build municipal wastewater treatment systems, and that's going to happen, but that's happening in decades, in multiple decades before that is completed. For example, Barnstable just released a wastewater treatment plant that will cost over $1 billion, that's billion with a B, for one town on the Cape, and it will probably take 40 or 50 years to implement, and it won't even cover the entire town. So clearly other things need to be done. So that's where the landscape comes in. And 18% of nitrate pollution comes from agriculture, landscape, and stormwater. And this is what Z. Crocker often calls a short-term first phase type of a fix. We can realize improvements very quickly by addressing the changes the landscape practices. And by doing this, ecological landscapes can be a part of the solution. So I'm advocating for ecological landscape design. This is design that reinforces local landscape character. It's beautiful through the seasons. It's sustainable and water friendly, doesn't require irrigation. It's pre-adapted to environmental extremes, including future more intensive climate with heat and drought likely to come to the Cape. So overall, it has a net positive environmental footprint, and it supports local biodiversity. It's another benefit thinking about the species other than humans that live on the Cape. And this points to the use of native plants. And native plants is, well, these are the plants that are native or indigenous to the area. But it's important to know that these plants are the basis for the terrestrial food chain. So these plants, the native plants, feed the native insects that feed the native birds. And here we see a pollinator, of course, monarch butterfly. And important to realize that these insects are very selective. They're in biological terms, they're called specialists. They don't just eat anything that they can find, but they're fussy. And they need the native plants in order to complete their life cycle. So I'm advocating a plant community approach to landscape design. And this is based on plant communities. These are groupings of plants that have evolved over millennia for local conditions. They're inherently adapted to the specific growing conditions. They've been growing here for thousands of years with no assistance from people, no irrigation, no fertilization. They're adapted to our dry soils, our sandy soils, and all the extremes that we have. They also express the local identity and sense of place. The native plants give the landscapes of the Cape and Islands their character. But they also have a specific structure that influences the visual character, and this is where we get into the design implications to make native landscapes that are beautiful for people, not only for other species, but of course they have to provide attractive, comfortable, memorable, beautiful landscapes for people. And in this context, we talk about management because native landscapes will change over time, and that change can be managed or steered to achieve a relative stability or to choreograph change. I won't read this quote. I have a few quotes in here, but a lot of authors have written eloquently about the beautiful character of the plants of the Cape. When plants grow in stressful environments, it's like an old person with wrinkles on their face. They develop character. They're gnarly, they're twisted, they're contorted and bent to avoid the salt spray. And this has a certain beauty that people who know Cape Cod are very familiar with. Here's a grove of sassafras trees on Nantucket, with another quote by Cape Cod author Robert Finch. So this is the character that I'm talking about, that this approach to landscape design is trying to recognize and to adapt and implement in designs. And this is based on plant communities. They're the essence of sustainable landscapes because they've existed for generations with no assistance. That's the definition of sustainability. Requiring minimal maintenance, can self-reproduce, no fertilizers or irrigation required, and they're adapted to future climate change. These plants also reinforce regional and local landscape character in terms of the visual appearance of the landscape, color and texture, form and scale. This is a quote from Frank Waugh, who is the founder of my department at UMass early in the 20th century. He had a great love for native plants and advocated this idea of plant communities, of starting with plants that grow together For example, here we can see a canopy species that provide shade for the understory and ground cover species below them, together forming a plant community. And then, I'm not an ecologist, I'm a landscape architect, so we design plant communities. We give them some special character to make them more visually interesting and appealing to people. So this is the idea of translating the native plant community into a familiar form. Claudia West calls it meeting nature halfway. So you can think of it as a hybrid of design, ecology, and horticulture. But of course, these plants are all adapted to the environmental conditions. Often in our designs, we simplify the plantings, and we may include some exotic plants if they're carefully selected not to be invasive and dependent on fertilizer and irrigation. So how do we do this? The first thing is to know your landscape context, your geographic and topographic position on the Cape. Close to the coast, you have to be more concerned with salt spray and even more sandy soils. Looking at the moisture content of the soil is important, the amount of sunlight that you have, and think about related populations of plant species, not individual plants. Communities implies populations, not individuals. And we need to cover the ground densely with these plants. And think about management, not maintenance. That's the idea of constant change and influencing that change through design. So I have studied the plant communities of the Cape, and I have proposed that these are the major plant communities that the majority of landscapes on the Cape will deal with. And I'll go through these kind of quickly so that we can remind ourselves of what they look like. And this grouping basically starts at the coasts, either on the bay or on the Nantucket or Atlantic side of the Cape. So here are the dunes where we have pure sand. This is just over this hill is the Nantucket Sound, but here's a gigantic patch of bayberry that's growing very beautifully with absolutely no care, giving beautiful multi-season interest. Here we can see the dunes transitioning into a maritime forest with eastern red cedar and also some beautiful heathland plants in the foreground, including beach heather. So that's what the dune community looks like. Off in the classical configuration, there's a fore dune closest to the water, and then a back dune behind it. And further inland, there's often an area where small trees and shrubs start to grow. The next plant community are sandplain grasslands and heathlands. These are globally rare plant communities that are endemic to the Cape and Islands, also to parts of Long Island and to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And these communities they're grasslands that were created really from the actions of people by introducing grazing and removing the trees for firewood and overgrazing the land even. And the only plants that could survive were these tough native grasses and a few wildflowers. And these communities are very important in the design sense because they have a phenomenal character. They give a sense of the open landscape. They let you see the sun and the sky, which is important. And they have fantastic seasonal color. As you can see, this example from Nantucket, the reddish in this is huckleberry, which is related to blueberry, a native shrub that gets a beautiful red twig color in the wintertime. And that's what the sandplain grasslands and heathlands look like a little closer up. Moving on, when we get a little bit inland from the coast, we start to see maritime shrublands and forests. These are usually in areas very, very controlled by salt spray from the ocean, which can extend, a mile or two in from the coast. It keeps the plants from getting too tall, and it favors plants that are tolerant of the salt spray and the pretty stressful growing conditions, including pitch pine and eastern red cedar and scrub oak, as you can see here and here. So these are what I'm showing. I'll remind you, these are not design communities. These are, excuse me, natural or untouched plant communities that can then be designed, as I'll show you later in the presentation. And here's what the maritime shrubland and forest look like in a diagrammatic cross-section. Next is a pretty iconic landscape for the Cape, pitch pine scrub oak forests. This is a stunted dwarf landscape. The pitch pines have a, excuse me, have a number of specific adaptations to real sandy conditions. They're adapted to drought, and they're also adapted to fires that commonly occurred on the Cape before people started suppressing the fires. And the pitch pines can actually regenerate foliage after they're burned, and they have bark that is resistant to the heat of a fire. And they're also, they're able to sprout new branches right through the bark of the tree. And they, because of this tough life they have, they develop what I would call a beautiful, picturesque habit, very much in scale with people. They're quite short, and they provide a, sometimes I would call it an enchanted forest character. And this is what they look like in cross-section. And here, these are closer to the coast. Here, the pitch pines are really dwarfed by the salt spray. The last two plant communities are forest communities. And the first is a pine oak forest, a little bit closer to the coast, a little bit more salt spray, and you will have pitch pine trees in the canopy, but also with a mixture of oak trees, including white oaks and black oaks and scrub oaks in the understory. And also these forests often have a fantastic and beautiful shrub understory with lowbush blueberry, huckleberry, summer sweet clethra, and inkberry, and beautiful native shrubs, all of them. And that's the pine oak forest. And the final plant community that I'm looking at here is the almost all hardwood trees. This is the coastal hardwood forest. This occurs in the most protected areas on the Cape, the furthest away from the salt spray and the coasts, where the oak trees have been allowed to stabilize and mature and produce a tall canopy, but with a very similar understory to the pine oak forest. So these are our template of plant communities that we're talking about here. And briefly, I want to talk about some of the elements in this toolkit that I'm proposing for how to manipulate those plant communities so that they look the way we want them to look. And we want to help them to change, or we want to try to keep them from changing. And that's why we talk about management, not maintenance. Maintenance implies that we're trying to maintain a static condition, maintaining a status quo. Management implies that we're allowing plants after all are living things. They grow, they mature, they get big, they die, other plants come in. So a landscape is a dynamic living system that can be managed, and it can be managed for aesthetic as well as for ecological reasons. And I'm proposing a balance of both of those. So here's one specific example. Turfgrass is one of the big culprits in on the Cape. We have over 25,000 acres of turfgrass on the Cape, according to the Cape Cod Commission, over 5,000 acres in the town of Barnstable alone. And the turfgrass, when it's irrigated and fertilized, has a tremendous impact on water resources. And it's a part of the problem that I've been describing. So of course, everyone loves a lawn. Lawns are beautiful and important to roll around on and play, but we could all probably do with less lawn. And that's where lawn alternatives come in. And here's three of them. The most lawn-like is in the upper left, the no-mow fescue lawn. These are special species of fescues that have been bred and hybridized to grow very slowly, that require, once established, no irrigation, and one or two mowings a year will keep them looking neat. Also, if you stop mowing a lawn, you'll end up with something on the bottom left is called a released lawn. This is mostly turf grasses that are allowed to grow to maturity, and wildflowers like Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susan will come in there. And on the right, we see one of the iconic plants from the Cape, the American beach grass. This is the plant that holds our dunes in place. It makes a fantastic lawn alternative. It spreads very vigorously, and obviously it's totally adaptable to growing in pure sand and requires no irrigation. Bearberry in the top left is a really beautiful native, very low growing shrub. We call it a ground cover. Will grow usually 6 to 12 inches tall at the most. It's evergreen, makes a very beautiful fine textured carpet that provides multi-season interest, including a purple foliage color in the winter. Here's a huckleberry on the left. This is a low shrub landscape that makes a beautiful understory in a forested condition. And on the right is a low bush blueberry patch that there's a beautiful example of management. Carlos Montoya does fantastic work on Martha's Vineyard. And this is one of his projects where he removed other species and kept the low bush blueberry in part for the stunning effect in the late fall season with the spectacular red fall color. A few other lawn alternatives. Hay-scented fern on the top left is a native fern that spreads very aggressively, sometimes too aggressively if you're trying to keep a neat garden. But if you want to cover a large area that's sunny, the hay-scented fern will do that very quickly. With the right kind of management, a moss lawn can be created, which is almost a spiritual or sacred kind of a landscape. Reminds me of Japanese Zen gardens, something very tranquil and beautiful about a moss carpeted lawn. And that requires, you have to keep the leaves from accumulating on it and keep some weeds out. And once it's established, it's extremely low maintenance. And finally, on the right is a sandplain grassland. This is one that was seeded by Carlos Montoya on the vineyard. And I like to think it is a really spectacular native grass, especially in the wintertime. And it really achieves its glory starting in the fall and throughout the winter when it develops this really beautiful peachy apricot color all the way throughout the winter. Another example of this idea of the ecological landscape toolbox, I want to show you how one species or plant can be managed over time to renew it and rejuvenate it. This is a drawing of a gray birch. This is the sometimes called the clump birch. It's an iconic species, beautiful white bark, upright. When it's in this form, everyone loves it. Unfortunately, when they get older, it's not a long-lived species. So they get old and the ice and snow falls on them. They bend over like this and they never recover. So they're not beautiful anymore at this point. So here's what you can do. Do some major pruning of the birch, cutting out the oldest stems, keeping a few of the younger stems, and selectively managing this as the tree rejuvenates itself. The root system remains viable. The top has been cut back, so these will grow back very quickly, a matter of 2 or 3 years to go through this whole sequence that I'm showing here. And then you arrive at this, which is, I call a second generation mature gray birch. And this will get too tall again in another decade and we'll need to start over. So that's a nice example of what I mean by management here. It's not plant a tree and leave it for 100 years. In this example, because this is a short-lived successional species, it requires this kind of occasional intervention every couple of years to keep it in a good form. Another example of this kind of management over time is with staghorn sumac, a spectacular native plant, beloved for its fall color. If you go to Western Europe, people have this prominently in their front garden because it's the best plant they can find for fall color. Here, people tend to think it's a weed. I believe that's because they don't understand how it can be managed to keep it in control. It does grow fast, it does spread. I'd like to illustrate how that spreading can be used to make a beautiful dome inside an open meadow. So for example, if you start in an open field, sumac is a clonal species. It has roots that connect to one another. And as those plants connect, they will spread with the oldest plants in the center getting taller and taller. And as it spreads, it forms this beautiful, beautiful dome. And this dome can last for 3 to 7 years. And then it can be mowed down again and start over. I've been doing this on my property for 30 years, and I cut the sumac down every 2 or 3 years, and I have a beautiful dome of sumac all the time. Now I have 7 examples of projects on the Cape and Islands that you can, a lot of these you can visit. Some of them are private homes, but these are examples of ecologically designed landscapes that kind of show what I'm talking about. The first is a residential property on Cape Cod Bay, designed by Studio 2112. This was a property that had been subject to a lot of coastal erosion. The dunes had been destroyed. In the large nor'easters that we get occasionally, the house was damaged. So the house was rebuilt and elevated onto a restored dune, which you can see here. And it was surrounded with a formal landscape of a hardscape of stone and wooden decking and beds of native plants. Here's the plan view of the property. On the left is the restored dune going down to Cape Cod Bay, and the terrace number 4 looking out over that. On the opposite side is a lawn that was converted into a beautiful meadow, and on the top of the slide is a brackish rain garden that was created to deal with the stormwater runoff. And you can see here a lot of the plants I was describing before. In the native plant communities, we have bayberry, eastern red cedar, high bush blueberry, and little blue stem grass and American beach grass closer to the water. And this is the meadow that replaced the former lawn. This is a meadow comprised of no-mow, fescue, little blue stem, asters, and lupin. This is a boardwalk path that goes down across the restored dune through the American beach grass down to the Cape Cod Bay. And a look up from the bottom in the summer season to show what that looks like. So this is a nice residential property that has no turf grass, all native species. It's also a nice example of a resilient landscape, a property that's been designed to be so that the house is situated well above anticipated future flood levels and storm events. This is another residential property on Martha's Vineyard in Edgartown on the Edgartown Great Pond. This is a project that with an interesting history. In the 1990s, a golf course was proposed for this site. There's approximately 100 acres here. The Nature Conservancy came in and purchased the land and collaborated with a private owner to negotiate an 80-acre conservation restriction. So the owner was allowed to build their house and to put a landscape around the house. But it's a very much of a light touch example, as you can see here, with the boardwalks and the lush beds of native plants. This is what a lot of the grassland looks like. This is a quintessential, spectacular sandplain grassland landscape. This is what I'm talking about. This is what Martha's Vineyard and the Cape are all about. These beautiful open landscapes, often framed with forests, including evergreens like pitch pine and eastern red cedar. This property is maintained by the Nature Conservancy by burning. This is a fun thing to do, but most of us aren't allowed to do this legally. But the Nature Conservancy gets the proper permits, and the burning simulates the natural disturbance that keeps this as a grassland and prevents it from reverting to a forest. They burn about 30 acres of the property every 4 years, so it doesn't have to be done every year. And this is the landscape that results there. The trees can be protected during the burn so that they're not destroyed. By the way, in the foreground is an example of that gray birch, the clump birch that I described earlier in the sequence. On the backside of the house, they've created a beautiful savanna landscape by selectively keeping some large mature oak trees interspersed in a lush meadow of sandplain grassland species. The prominent one here is little bluestem. And of course, the nicely wide mown path, which we all know, many of these landscapes are also very good habitat for ticks. People always ask, well, what about the ticks? Well, if you mow a wide path like this, you do a lot to avoid your exposure to ticks. Of course, it's always wise to check yourself after you've been outside. And last view of this very special landscape in Edgartown on the Vineyard. Another project from the Vineyard is at the West Tisbury Free Library. This was a garden that was installed in 2014 when the new library was built. And the goal of this library landscape was to demonstrate the benefits of natural landscaping, energy conservation, and wildlife and biodiversity plantings. The concept was a teaching garden with interpretive signs, and this was designed in consultation with Tim Boland from the Polly Hill Arboretum, which is very nearby. And it includes a lot of, here we see a lot of North American prairie species, including fountain grass, switchgrass, mountain mint, and purple coneflower. This is the main walkway to the library with this kind of a show garden. So these are all native species, not all native to Cape Cod, but perfectly or to the Vineyard, but perfectly adapted to there. They've done a nice job of dealing with their water runoff from the parking lot by creating a swale, which is a linear trench, basically, that's graded such that the stormwater from the parking lot will drain and flow into this swale and then percolate into the ground. The plants will slow that water and remove some of the contaminants from it. So here it's called an engineered bioswale with great sensitivity to water quality. So there's a nice example of a designed landscape that's really taking care of its own impacts on water. And again, you know, landscaping a parking lot, right? It's an opportunity to put native plants and display them and make a memorable experience for people visiting the library. Out around the back, there's a habitat garden with some more showy wildflower species, a quiet reading garden with a nice clump of sweet fern, another beautiful native that's perfectly adapted to really sterile sandy soils. And out in the back is a habitat garden that really hits its peak in late summer when the plants get to be about 5 or 6 feet tall, including boneset, the white plant, and a few species of goldenrod in yellow. The International Fund for Animal Welfare is the world headquarters of this organization, located in Yarmouth. And this project was designed by Stimson Associates, formerly of Falmouth, now of Cambridge. Stimson did a very special redesign here of a courtyard. The building was designed to be inspired by the Bartlett Farm in Barnstable and created a very sunny courtyard. This site was a brownfield. Which is a contaminated post-industrial site. And so there were serious challenges here. The designers solved that problem by building a native landscape on top of the brownfield so that it would be separated from the contaminated soil. And we'll see that now. Here's the courtyard with a nice wooden deck boardwalk overlooking the large meadow. And this is the drumlin landscape that was created with sand and gravel to simulate one of the important post-glacial landscapes that's common on the Cape and Islands, the drumlin. And this meadow was planted very successfully with switchgrass and little bluestem. And this helped to reconnect the site with its context. Here is an example of how the parking lot was planted with a nice planting of switchgrass and native birch trees in the background. Over in Dennis on Route 6A is the headquarters of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. And the APCC has built a really beautiful demonstration ecological landscape right on Route 6A. This was designed by Kristen Andres from APCC and Blue Sage Design. And I would encourage you to drive by and look at it. There's some nice interpretive signs that explain what they did and what species are planted. This is what they're calling a Cape Cod meadow garden with swamp milkweed, Joe Pye weed. What else can I see here? Wild bergamot and goldenrod. And the meadow garden comes around on the side here. They have also included a rain garden to deal with the runoff from the property. And they have installed very porous paving materials so that the rain that falls on the walkway and on part of the parking lot goes right through the pavement into the groundwater. So this is this is the organization that did the study of the freshwater ponds last fall. And here's an organization that's walking the talk by showing people what they can do and what a landscape like this looks like through the seasons. And of course, that's the key, is to look at these places in different seasons. This is a private residence in Mashpee, designed by Talbot Ecological Land Care. This was a kind of a typical residential property. And when the house was built, the contractors mistakenly cut down a lot of trees, leaving the house very exposed, which isn't what the owners had intended. So they replanted a buffer between the house and the street. The owners are very avid bird watchers and feeders, so they built a bird feeder array surrounded by native plants, including winterberry holly here. You can see the red berries, a beautiful plant that provides visual interest for us humans and also is enjoyed by the birds, usually around January. Something happens to the fruit around January when the birds decide that it's good to eat. but all through the fall, we get the benefit of this beautiful red color. And here's the owner in the garden in the summer season with native viburnums and dogwoods, providing a beautiful enclosed lawn space with all native shrubs. And that's what it looks like in the wintertime. The My Toy Gardens is a property of the Trustees of Reservations. It's on Chappaquiddick Island. It is open to the public. It's a spectacular garden with an interesting history. It was a private garden until 1976 when it was given to the trustees. At that time, it was a little bit less developed than it is now. Hurricane Bob really devastated this garden in 1991, and it had to be replanted, and it was redesigned by a famous landscape designer, Julie Meservey. And she's written a beautiful book called Contemplative Gardens, if you're interested in her work. Here you can see a very Japanese-inspired design. In fact, that's where the name comes from. The person who built the garden had spent time in Japan in the war, World War II, and was inspired by the gardens and the landscapes that he saw. And he created this Japanese style garden on the vineyard, and he gave it the name My Toy, which literally means my toy. But it sounds like a Japanese name. Beautiful walkways here to experience the pond, different viewpoints as you walk through. Here's my friend, the hay-scented fern that I said was a beautiful alternative to turf grass. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up with a few of the points that I hope I've made clearly. The issues with conventional landscape design, they are generic. They don't really say or reinforce the character of Cape Cod. The generic landscapes are not adapted to the Cape and Islands environment. We could say they're not sustainable. In some cases, they contribute to water quality impacts. And most importantly, they always displace native plant communities. We can't have two things in the same place. So every acre we build with conventional landscapes is one less acre of native landscape. The benefits of ecological landscape design, these plants are pre-adapted to the Cape and the islands, and they're also adaptable and adapted to future climatic conditions because they're already living with extreme stress for moisture and heat. Think about the conditions that dune grasses grow in, baking in absolute full sun with virtually no water holding in the sand, and year after year they come back. So a lot of these species are going to do very well in future more severe climates. So these are water-friendly landscapes. They reinforce landscape character because, like the landscapes I showed you, they're surrounded by natural landscapes that have the same species. Working with native and designed plant communities, the 6 communities I discussed, from the dunes to the coastal hardwood forest, and this idea of meeting nature halfway. I'm not advocating stepping back and just letting nature take over. Rather, I'm talking about some ecologically inspired horticulture and design to work with nature, including the dynamics of how it changes over time. And that's where we get into the Ecological Landscape Design Toolkit. When my book is finished later this year, I will have more tools in the toolkit. But tonight we talked about the lawn alternatives and how to make stable shrubs, and a little bit about successional plant dynamics. And I think that's, yeah, that's where I am. That's where I'm finishing up. I hope I've given you something to think about. And here's my contact information if you are interested to get in touch with me with questions or anything. And I think I will unshare my screen, and we will.
So we'll go over, Jack, can you hear me now? It's Z.
Yes, I
And
can.
everybody can probably hear me. So, thank you very, very much. It was informative, interesting, raised a lot of questions in my mind. And we have a few questions, and I have questions myself. The first question we have is actually one that I'll take because it's more about our work at Barnstable Clean Water. And the question from Amy is, you talk about nitrate pollution. Isn't phosphorus more of a problem for our ponds and lakes? And thank you, Amy, for that. We're starting a project at Shubal Pond, as many people on the Zoom will know. And part of that is to understand more about that very question, Amy, because the more work that the scientists do, and I'm no scientist, I'm a layperson, but I've tried to learn a lot. But the more we learn is that it's actually the interaction of phosphorus and nitrogen in our ponds that causes a lot of the conditions that are troubling in the ponds right now. So it may not be one element itself, but the mix of those elements in a particular location. And so we're doing work. We're going to put in a number of septic systems, change them over to a new kind of septic system that removes a lot of nitrogen, that should also, as we adapt to it, remove a lot of phosphorus. And we're hoping we can learn a lot about that pond and other ponds, so we can take steps in the future that will help us out a lot, as far as our wonderful ponds here on Cape Cod, which are so iconic. And then, Jack, can you see all the questions? Cynthia has a question. What trees
just a little
were
bit,
here?
a little more on phosphorus.
Okay, thank you.
Some of you might know that the new regulations on fertilizer basically prohibit using phosphorus in any landscape fertilizer unless a soil test indicates a need for it, which is very unlikely. And I was very pleased to see that a lot of the garden centers on the Cape are now starting to carry fertilizers that don't have phosphorus. So we might be able to remove that input very, very quickly. The nitrogen is going to be more challenging because that's what the main ingredient of fertilizer, especially for lawns, is all about, is getting nitrogen onto the land.
Thank you,
Other
Jack.
questions?
You can see them?
No.
I'll read them. I'll read them if you can't. So,
oh, here it is. Yeah.
Got it? Okay.
Yes.
Cynthia.
What trees were here when the Europeans arrived? Good question. It was most likely a lot like the pine oak forest and the coastal hardwood forest that we saw. The native people who were here, the Wampanoags, did do some clearing and did do some small burning, but it was a very light touch. They did that for agriculture and for hunting, but the landscape was generally forested with a hardwood forest. The colonists took care of that pretty quick and burned everything. What they didn't use for construction, they burned for heat, and also to create open land for agriculture and pasturage. And the Cape and Islands have a very interesting history of overgrazing by sheep that kept the forests away for a long time. And slowly the pitch pines started to come back because they were the most adaptable to the fire conditions that were common under those conditions. Okay, another question about planting with an eye towards global warming. Cape Cod might one day have the climate of the Carolinas. Yes, absolutely. There will be winners and losers among the species that grow on the Cape now. The losers will include some of the birches, definitely the sugar maple, maybe some of the forest oaks are going to be, it's going to get too hot for some of those species. Some of our species are very likely to adapt to this. I've mentioned some of those: American beach grass, little blue stem, eastern red cedar. And then we're likely to see other species move into the Cape or be brought here intentionally. And I will include lists of those in my book. But those, well, there'll be some interesting and beautiful native species that will be able to grow here. For example, sweet bay magnolia and species like American holly are likely to remain as well and to even thrive more under the new conditions, because American holly grows all the way down to the Gulf Coast now. Okay. Bruce asked, how tall is the Nomo fescue? As you saw in the photograph, it can get a little tall if you don't mow it at all. But if you mow it in the late spring after the first flush of growth and in the early fall, you can keep it to 3 to 5 inches tall, a little taller than a common lawn. And it's not a good lawn for heavy foot traffic. It's more for lawns like most people use their lawns as a kind of a foreground, a place to sit occasionally, or as an open area in front of a shrub border. And Cynthia asked, can she transplant sweet fern? Good question. Sweet fern is a rhizomatous plant that it spreads by underground roots. If you try to dig it up, you will find that you get very little root when you dig it up, because it's connected to a much larger system. If you have the patience, the best thing to do is to do root pruning. So you could go out now, if you have a patch of sweet fern, and go around a few plants with a shovel and cut the roots, but leave the plant in place. Now you're kind of slapping the plant in the face, but it's not going to die because some of the roots are still in the exact soil that was growing in. It has the same amount of sunlight, the same amount of moisture. So it's likely to survive, and it will regenerate new roots closer to the main stem. And then if you come back a year or two later, then you can dig the sweet fern very easily. I've also heard that you can take root cuttings from the sweet fern. It might be a little late for that now, but in the late winter, you can dig up a patch of it and cut the roots into sections and propagate them in soil and get them to root that way. But just regular harvesting usually doesn't work. I see, are you there, Z?
I'm here, yep. I see an anonymous question. Can I get
anonymous?
in trouble
Okay.
with my town if I stop mowing my lawn and just let it grow? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think so, but.
Well, try it out is what I say. One of my favorite books is by Michael Pollan. He wrote a book called Second Nature, where he among other things, he questions people's love and kind of blind acceptance of lawns. And he grew up in Long Island, and his father hated to mow the lawn and stopped mowing it, and created an uproar in the neighborhood. And he actually went out with his lawnmower and wrote F you with his lawnmower for his neighbors to know what he. More seriously, anonymous. One of the strategies we use in landscape architecture to get people to accept more wild-looking landscapes is called orderly frames. So if you have an area that you're going to release from mowing, if you mow a border around it and a path through it, people look at it and say, "Oh, somebody's doing something here. This isn't just a lazy person or someone who forgot to mow their lawn." So it's a strategy that has been proven to be effective through research by showing photographs to many different people, and people will accept a lot of more naturalistic landscapes when they look like they are being maintained intentionally. Intentionality is a big part of it. There's other ways to do it besides mowing it. Fencing is another way. Having a fence border through an area is another way to signal to people that you are doing something intentionally. And if you stop mowing your lawn, you can also, of course, enhance the color by transplanting wildflowers into it. And of course, they will thrive because they're not being mowed down every year. And depending on how fine of a lawn you have now, let's say, the typical, Cape Cod lawn that has grass and a lot of other species in it, if you stop mowing that, you're going to really be surprised at how many colorful wildflowers are already growing there, but you can never see them because they're mowed all the time.
So if you scroll down, Jack, you'll see a number of more questions.
Oh, okay, more, good. Okay, Cynthia, list of native species to Cape Cod, and where can you purchase the seeds and the plant shrubs? Well, this is a challenge. The nurseries are starting to carry more native species. Go to your garden center and tell them, why don't you sell beach grass? Why can't I buy bayberry? I went to a local place a few years ago. I won't name it, and I said, "Oh, do you sell pitch pine?" And they said, "Oh, is the Conservation Commission making you plant that?" And I said, "No, I think it's a beautiful plant." So there's a little bit of a cultural change that's needed. The Native Plant Trust, formerly known as the New England Wildflower Society, headquartered in Framingham. They also have a nursery in Western Mass where they grow a lot of native shrubs. That's another source. My book will have a lot more of these. UMass Extension has the book about native species for Cape and the islands as well. So I hope I answered your question. Joshua asked, challenges in constructing landscapes is establishment. How do you recommend better promoting native plant communities adapted to poor soils in our grow now culture? Okay, good question. A lot of people who try to grow grasslands fail because it's a little tricky to get them established. It should be thought of as a long-term proposition. In my research for my book, I interviewed a lot of successful landscape professionals, including Seth Wilkinson from Orleans and Carlos Montoya from the Vineyard, two of the real experts in this. And both of them use irrigation for the first year to get these meadows established. Because if you don't irrigate them and if you don't get the right conditions, you run into the impatience that a lot of clients will have, that they want to have an instant landscape. And even with that, it's going to take a few years because, for example, the little blue stem, the keystone species of these grasslands, is incredibly slow to establish. It takes at least 2 years, sometimes 3 or 4, to really get to a mature size. And depending on the size of the project, another strategy is to work with live plants, either plugs or potted plants. It costs a lot of money to do a large area with that method, but that's a way to speed up the process as well. Heavy clay soils. How does that affect the landscapes? There's not a lot of heavy clay soils on the Cape, but there are some. They tend to be in the areas along the moraines, which on the Cape is the Falmouth moraine and the Sandwich moraine. There, I would look at the native species that are growing there. For example, my favorite beautiful native tree is the black tupelo, Nyssa sylvatica. which is a spectacular native tree, very well adapted to heavy clay soils and wet soils. Clethra alnifolia is also well adapted to clay soils and wet conditions. Inkberry holly, yeah, there's a few off the top of my head. Pamela asks how to convert a regular lawn to no-mow fescue. That would require removing the lawn and reseeding it, Cynthia. And that it can be removed mechanically by digging it out. It can be removed with herbicides if you're amenable to that. Herbicides are, of course, a controversial material and should be used very cautiously. But I'll make one point to, distinguish between repeated, regular, chronic use of herbicides where they can accumulate and where people can be exposed to them versus a strategic one-time use of herbicide to kill a lawn so that you can reseed it. If you have a smaller lawn, another option is to solarize the lawn. Takes patience. You have to cover it with heavy opaque plastic, weigh it down very well on all the corners with stones or bricks, wait a couple of years, and then you'll be able to seed it. So depending on your time frame and your patience and the type of work that you want to do, those would be the options to do it. Because the turfgrass species that are in a regular lawn, they don't give up easy. They have strong root systems. They spread horizontally, and they're very tough to get rid of. So without one of those approaches, you'll have a problem to get the no-mow fescue. Cynthia asked, are Gila boars considered invasive? To my knowledge, no, they're not invasive. And the way that native species, you can be a purist about this and only use native species, or a more purist and use only native to Cape Cod, or you can have a more flexible approach and say, no, I really love a couple of hydrangeas, because nothing like a blue hydrangea in August. And that's certainly can be a part of a solution in a larger context of ecological landscape. Jim asks, where can he purchase bulk switchgrass? Most of the providers of seed for the prairie grasses, including switchgrass, come from the Midwest. And the ones that I usually work with are Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin and Prairie Moon Nursery. I think they're in Minnesota. And then some of the wholesalers will sell bulk switchgrass. You could try North Creek Nursery sells switchgrass in quantity. They're in Pennsylvania. They generally don't sell to the public, but if you were making a significant order, they would probably be happy to oblige. And where can we purchase native plants? Some of the nurseries have them, of course. I think it's important for us all to ask for them and request them, so that the nurseries hear that and they'll get the word, and they're in the business of selling plants. So if we can increase the demand, they will meet the demand for sure. And it's already starting to happen, but it's a slow process. And also, I mentioned the Native Plant Trust. A lot of the garden, on the vineyard, the Polyhill Arboretum has a beautiful program of growing native plants from native seed collected on the vineyard. They're really doing it right. And but you know, these are small quantities of plants, not large ones. Um, Doug asked about pollinator-friendly plants. Lots of the meadow species, goldenrods, asters, coneflowers, bergamot. Those are really wonderful for pollinators. I don't have time to go through the whole list, but if you Google that, you'll find there's a lot of native herbaceous plants that are good for pollinators. Justin, my friend from UMass, asks about this challenge of establishment and getting these landscapes established compared to managing them in the following years. This is, I've spoken a little bit about this earlier. It's these sandplain grasslands and other types of meadows have species that can be outcompeted with invasive species that are present in the soil when you disturb the soil. So there's a bit of an art and a science to it, and it includes, for example, after you seed a meadow, it's recommended to mow that meadow for the first 2 years. The first year to mow it at a height of about 6 inches. When it gets to 12, cut it down to 6, 3 or 4 times in that first year. And that will prevent the weeds from growing tall and making seeds. And then the second year, and in the meantime, the native grasses and wildflowers will have germinated. And in the meantime, in the second year, you should mow it at about 12 inches every time it gets to knee high. And that will also keep the invasive annual weeds from setting seed. And it will also favor the maturing grasslands. After the second year, it should be good. And then the native grasses are going to outcompete these annual aggressive native species. But it does take a commitment. In the landscape business, a lot of clients are not interested in that. So this is going to take a change in culture to get people to understand how to be patient. And it's, you know, us professionals need to communicate that to our clients so that they understand it and at the beginning, and they're not surprised that they don't have a stunning meadow. The meadow industry used to promote this idea called the meadow in a can. And people had this idea you could just sprinkle seeds on your lawn and come back next year and have a beautiful meadow. And unfortunately, that's completely unrealistic. That does not happen. What plant will feed monarch butterflies? The best one I know is New England aster, or any of the asters, or the goldenrods also. The late flowering wildflowers are good because that's when the monarchs are moving through. For the monarchs, no, is the milkweed is the preferred plant for the larvae monarchs. They need that specific plant. It's not the showiest native plant, but a lot of people are starting to plant milkweed because it's really important and fundamental for the monarchs. And Jim asks about removing black locust from his property. Well, you're asking me, and I find black locust to be a really beautiful tree. I love the gently curving form of the trunks and the deep ridges in the bark, the fine textured foliage that lets the sun come through. And don't forget the beautiful white flowers in June. Black locust is, it's the only native plant that's officially considered an invasive plant because it is a bit aggressive. So, it's not legal to sell it in Massachusetts. But if I had it growing, I would, without seeing your property, I would probably recommend keeping it, maybe thinning out a few of them if there's a large grove, so that you can see that beautiful branching structure that I mentioned. Let's see. Cynthia asks, what native grasses were the sheep eating when they were grazing all over the Cape? I'm sure that there were European pasture grasses, timothy and alfalfa and fescues, but I'm also sure that there would have been a lot of the sandplain grassland species that they're just going to outcompete those other species on sandy soils. So in the really sandy, nutrient poor soils, the sandplain grassland species are really the only thing that can survive long term without love and care and irrigation and fertilizer. So over time, those plants would win out. But of course, in a sheep meadow, you have sheep manure that's going to always be redistributing the nutrients. So it's a good question, and that's my best guess on that one. Jim asked, what is the low-growing wild bunch grass called that grows in and around the woods on slopes? One of the common native grasses on the Cape, Jim, is the Latin name is Deschampsia hairgrass. There's two species of hairgrass, and those are clump-forming native grasses that have a beautiful seed head late in the season that persists through the winter. I think I answered, how to get rid of swallowwort. Well, swallowwort is a wicked plant. It's a terrible, highly invasive plant. And I think we're just seeing the beginning of the invasion of swallowwort. So again, kind of what I said before about the lawn. One good thing about herbicides is herbicides will kill the entire plant. And I should make a point to distinguish between broadcast herbicide and targeted use of herbicide. So if you're concerned about contaminating the environment, then you can mix up a very small batch of herbicide and have a brush and actually just paint it onto that one plant. You can keep it from getting onto any other plant. The herbicide will be absorbed and systemically incorporated in the plant and will kill the plant to the roots, which is important because a lot of invasive species, including swallowwort, especially plants like knotweed, you can pull that every year for the rest of your life, and it will just keep coming back because small fragments in the ground will regenerate. So that's why I advocate, in appropriate situations, a judicious and responsible use of herbicide to kind of get yourself on track so that you can establish a plant community that won't allow these invasive to get established. They often need a disturbed location to get established, and once you have a mature, dense planting of native plants, the number of invasives will greatly be reduced. Particular herbicide, glyphosate is the go-to all-purpose herbicide. The trade name is Roundup, and that's, there are other herbicides that are specific for different types of plants, but that one is generally effective for all of these that I've been mentioning. Mary Rita asks about pussy willow. That's a beautiful native shrub. It is a willow in the same genus as the species of trees. And the pussy willow, of course, is really a lovely sign of early spring, pretty much finished by now. It prefers wet locations, and it's a subtle flower, but if you have an eye for it, it's quite graceful and beautiful.
Jack, you've really done a great job with all these questions. So thank you so much. So in the chat room, there's a couple of parting shots, and then I think we'll thank you very much, and we'll all head out to. It's not a sunny evening anymore, but it's a nice evening. So I think you answered this, but the question from Margaret is there a native wildflower mix that she could plant instead of buying individual perennials?
Yes. Again, I would recommend Prairie Nursery, Prairie Moon Nursery, and there is a little closer source, Ernst Seeds in Pennsylvania, ERNST. Ernst Seeds is and they grow some of their seed regionally. A lot of the species that grow in our wildflower meadows are really common out in the prairie states, and that's where they have the skill and the expertise to grow large crops for seeds. But any of those would have good seed mixes that are reasonably priced for residential application.
Well, once again, I really want to thank you, Jack. Thanks for being a great partner. To really the community here on Cape Cod, to Barnstable Clean Water Coalition. Everybody should know that we're going to see the trustees that have some presence on the Cape expanding that presence. In fact, right in Osterville, they've essentially acquired the property down the street at Armstrong Kelly Park, which is about an 8-acre site. Jack and I have talked to the trustees, and they're excited to work with Jack. It's interesting that they control right now 120 miles of a coastline in Massachusetts, the biggest owner, and so we'll be working with them on other areas, water quality related and resiliency related in terms of the coastal areas, which are so important to all of us here on the Cape. We hope that many people on the line, and we had over 70 at one point, will get in touch with us, will partner with us. There's a lot that we need to do, a lot we need to learn, not just for our own individual sites, and we'll be publishing a few brochures with the help of Jack and one of his students on the Shubal Pond area to look at some of these native plants and how they can fit in with some good illustrations that are really fairly straightforward, that I think anybody on the line could use as a platform while we wait for Jack's book to come out. And we need your help. We need your help to educate our landscapers and our community about how to do better, how to work better here on Cape Cod. So thank you, Jack. Thanks so much. And thanks, Heather, and our team on the line. So thanks, everybody, for participating. Great event.
Thanks for hosting it, Zeke.
Have a great evening, everybody. Take care.
Okay, good night.